Within the world of video games, puzzles are everywhere. There are so many games that just like to throw in a cheeky puzzle room or a fetch quest where you have to use your own logic to figure out what it is that you need to find. And these sorts of little puzzles help to give the player a much more involved role in the story. Want to make the cat boy happy? Give the little dude some pancakes. Puzzle solved, and you feel like a good person. If you can't use your own problem solving skills to figure out how to proceed, you won't be able to advance in the story. On top of this, the human brain absolutely loves puzzles. They're something that have been around for centuries. They help to keep our brains sharp, let us brag to our friends, and give us a nice little burst of dopamine for each puzzle we solve. And this is no different when playing video games. When done right, a puzzle game can really stimulate the brain and feel so satisfying to play through. And when done wrong, it can be frustrating, boring, and void of any sort of satisfaction. So, what exactly makes a good puzzle game? A lot of the challenge in a puzzle game comes from its rules and mechanics, things that limit you enough that you have to do some problem solving, and the tools to use to solve the puzzles. Portal is limited by the fact that you are stuck inside of rooms, can only use portals on certain types of surfaces, and lose your portals when you go through blue light screens. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker limits your movements and only lets you walk around and interact with some objects. Baba Is You limits you based on what the rule set for each level is, giving each puzzle different limitations from the last. And OneShot is limited in what objects you can find and what there is to interact with. While limitations and rules can often feel really restricting, that's sort of their point, especially in puzzle games. Trying to figure out how to get through a level while not being able to do the obvious thing is what makes our brains think outside the box. The ability to jump is really commonplace in video games, but when we take that away, suddenly we have to come up with a new clever strategy to beat the level. Now that we have our rules and restrictions, we get to sprinkle some mechanics into the mix. These are the things that a game can start to base its level design around, and help one game completely stand out from all of the others in the genre. The main mechanic in Portal is, well, portals. You don't get any bonus points for guessing that one. The levels can then be designed around the player using portals and the game's general physics. Captain Toad can use power-ups, throw turnips, and interact with various stage elements. Baba Is You once again kinda depends on what is going on in each level. Usually, the player can control Baba, or I guess, a rock, or whatever else, and can push around words to try and create new sentences that alter the game's mechanics and rule sets. OneShot has the standard running and interacting mechanics that every RPG type game has, but is able to combine items to help solve different problems that you face. Combining these rules and mechanics is what creates a puzzle, and what gives it its solution. The game needs to give the player the tools to beat the level, but that tool can't just be a friggin' power saw that they can just brute force their way through the game with. Portal gives us the portal gun, but it doesn't want us to jump to the end of the level each time. It's more so used to get around the stage, doing things like pushing buttons or guarding energy balls. In some cases, we're relying on the momentum and portals to fling us around the map, and after some motion sickness, we can start to beat every stage that the game throws at us. It's really important that a mechanic can't be overly strong, to the point where half the stages can be beat just by using the same technique. Baba Is You gets around this by carefully creating levels where the mechanics of the game differ depending on which level you're playing. A lot of the time, this will wall off some set rules that it doesn't want to be changed, because hey, if Jesus can walk on water, I'll be damned if this wall's gonna stop me. This would be way too easy if it's how we beat every level, so in some cases, they put this rule in jail so that it can never be changed. Baba's entire gameplay revolves around changing different mechanics, and while, in theory, this could get pretty boring since what we're doing essentially boils down to moving words around to get different outcomes each time, but the actual puzzle solving comes with thinking a little bit outside of the box. The game is called Baba Is You, but what if Baba is not you, and you are a rock, and now rock move, unga bunga? In retrospect, yeah, this makes sense and is really clever. But at the same time, we don't really realise that Baba was always a vessel for us to move, and not actually a depiction of us. We are you, Baba is not you, unless he is you, but sometimes Rock is you, or Rock is something else, or sometimes you is Rock and Baba. Puzzle games, everybody. My head hurts. This sort of thing never gets repetitive because the level design and the solution always feels different, even if the method to get to that solution is based on one main mechanic. Probably one of the most important things that a puzzle game needs to get right is the difficulty curve. The first level or area should generally always feel less challenging than you are skilled. If a game starts and immediately stumps you, 9 times out of 10 that's probably the game's fault rather than the player's. The first level has a lot of very important jobs. It needs to educate the player on how the game plays and what it is looking for from you. Captain Toad starts us on what is the absolute minimum requirement for what could be considered as a puzzle. You just walk around this spiral walkway, rotate the camera, and get the obvious goal. But just in that, the game has immediately conveyed to the player what they are supposed to do. Then the first real level just builds on that idea. The player should now know what to do, so throwing in some more stuff while keeping the level easy is fine. The game only keeps progressing from there, and while this is definitely a much slower progression of difficulty, because of it being aimed towards kids mainly, it's still a pretty great example of easing the player into a puzzle game. Looking at Portal, the game really needed to ease the player into the whole portal gun mechanic. The game starts us in a room and creates the portals for us. They're not too far away from each other and give us a chance to really grasp the idea of portals. From there, we eventually get the chance to create some blue portals to get to preset orange ones. This is because the game still needs to demonstrate to us the potential of portal placement. When we are given both the blue and the orange portals to play with, we already have a great understanding of what we can do with them, and the game can start designing levels with that in mind. OneShot is a game that I think throws the player into the deep end a little bit too much. Throughout the entire game, most of the puzzles come from exploration and finding certain items that can be either used to advance the story or can be combined with other items to solve issues. However, the game starts us out in a room with very few things to interact with, but gives us absolutely no clues as to what we're meant to do. When interacting with the computer, it's obvious that we need to put in some sort of code, but what isn't obvious is how to figure it out. When we pick up the TV remote and look at it in our inventory, there is a message at the top saying it's too hard to read in dark light. And really, looking back at it after finishing the game, the solution makes sense. The game wants us to equip it, then go over and interact with the window, because that is where a little bit of light is shining from, which gives us the code. This puzzle wouldn't feel out of place at all if it were near the end of the game, but putting it right at the start really did stump me. The player reasonably wouldn't know that the game wants us to equip items and interact with things in the way we need to, and we have absolutely no information to go off of for what the actual goal is. Maybe this game wants us to go and smash the computer with the remote. I don't know, we have nothing to go off yet. After playing through and finishing the game, I have a much better understanding of what the game expects from the player and what it's trying to go for. But honestly, the first small chunk of it felt unnecessarily cryptic to me. If anything, the puzzles are much harder at the start of the game than at the end, because for the most part, they're all using a pretty similar principle. Explore your surroundings, talk with people, and find items that you can use. And once I was used to that idea, it felt much more fun to play through. But near the start, I was just sort of using half my brain power, figuring out what the game is looking for. This isn't to say OneShot's puzzles are bad by any means, just they don't really ease you into the game at all. The puzzle genre is one of the absolute best when it comes to this idea of flow state. They ideally want us to be in flow for as much of the game as possible. This comes when we are being challenged just the right amount. If the puzzle becomes too difficult, too fast, it's just going to become frustrating and annoying more than anything, and we lose focus. If the puzzles don't progress fast enough, the player can start to get a little bit bored, because there isn't really a challenge in what is supposed to be a challenging game. This also lines up really nicely with what puzzle games want to make the player feel, which is to feel smart and proud after each puzzle they solve. Portal can't really be faulted in this area. The entire game really does feel like it challenges you a near perfect amount each time. And just when you start to master every single mechanic of the game, everything is flipped on its head while you're running through the Aperture Labs to escape your death, throwing all sorts of new challenges at you that are familiar enough for you to understand, but new enough to challenge the player all over again. Baba Is You also constantly feels challenging for me. I'll admit that there were a few times that this flow state was broken, because I just couldn't really figure out certain puzzles. But as soon as I got onto the next level, I was back at it again. Another way that Baba feels challenging constantly is due to how creative the game is, which forces you to be creative too. And in turn, you don't only feel clever for solving the puzzle, but clever for being able to think in a way that you didn't even realise you could. Captain Toad is definitely a much more casual puzzle game, but even then, it had a lot of areas that got me to really think about every outcome to my actions, and made me feel really great for beating. OneShot took a bit of time before I could really start feeling this flow state. Part of that is probably because I'm less used to its style of puzzles. We have to go around collecting things, talking to people in an RPG sense, but especially near the end of the game, I was completely gripped to everything it was doing. Using two different windows to figure out where we should go was one of the most creative things I have ever seen a game do, and in turn, it made me feel a little creative while doing it. The start of the game was definitely less friendly towards new players, which meant that I couldn't really get into this flow state at any point, because I was constantly having to backtrack and f around with things in hopes that it would be the solution to my problems, but when I did figure out what I was supposed to do, it felt pretty nice. Later in the game, I started to get really invested into the story and the puzzles, and started being able to figure out exactly what I was supposed to do, and that was the point where I started engaging in flow, and the game became so much more fun. Not all puzzle games need to have any form of story. Baba Is You just has lots and lots of cool levels, and while Captain Toad has a story, its levels don't really feel like they would need one for the most part anyway. This is the way of most puzzle games. Anything from Tetris to word searches, the main gameplay doesn't really need a story to work well. But some games manage to weave both gameplay and story together to create something even greater. Portal of course does this using GLaDOS. She is using the player to do research on how they solve different puzzle rooms, and also because she's a psycho sadist maniac, but mainly the research thing. The story really kicks off in the final section of the game, where you're trying to escape, and it suddenly feels like less of a puzzle game and more of an action-adventure game that is filled with puzzles and obstacles to overcome. While the game would still be a fantastic puzzler, without any sort of narrative to follow, this added story element over the top gives so much more weight to each puzzle solved. This life or death situation near the end speaks for itself as to why we want to beat it, and the normal puzzles become so much more entertaining with GLaDOS's comments over the top. OneShot story does a very similar thing. Once we start figuring out our goals and what is at stake, each puzzle starts to feel a lot more important. We aren't just doing this for the sake of beating puzzles, we're doing this to try and save the characters that we meet along the way and to help Nico finish his quest and get back to his mother. This really motivated me through the second half of the game. Meeting with different characters and having new areas to explore kept me invested in a lot of the puzzles that I would have otherwise found more tricky, and the pressure of trying to save the world gave me a huge reason to keep going. Puzzle games are one of the most popular genres of gaming. A lot of the time they can be something to pass the time for 30 minutes, sometimes they can be used to help boost our mood, and in a lot of cases they can be used to tell some amazing stories. It's no wonder why so many of these games are being made. They're accessible to most people, and often available everywhere. It can sometimes be pretty hard for the game to get everything right, but things like difficulty progression, flow state, and a good balance of mechanics and rule sets can often result in a fun, challenging, unique, and original puzzle game experience. And hey, throw some pancakes in there and a story to fight for, and you've got a cult classic on your hands.